Resident Evil is one of the most iconic horror series to ever exist in video games, created by Capcom in 1996. While it didn't pioneer the survival horror genre, it was the main game to make it popular. I've officially started my journey through the Resident Evil series, and I'm very excited for Resident Evil 9, so I wanted to commemorate this by going on a journey through the evolution of horror in every single Resident Evil game. Welcome to the Series Saga, where we discuss the distinctive features, evolution, and impact of our favorite video game franchises. We're going to talk about what worked and what didn't from a horror perspective, the gameplay, the enemies, the atmosphere, the lore, and concluding with a grade at the end. So if you enjoy, consider liking and subscribing to follow along. Or if you get bored, I have other horror content to watch as well. Without further ado, let's dive into one of the most iconic horror games to ever exist, Resident Evil 1. The game begins with me choosing the wrong character. I chose Chris because I thought, I'm a man, I should play as man. Not the case here, because what I realized quickly is that with Resident Evil 1, it is more so a puzzle game with a layer of horror painted over the entire thing. The entire series revolves around inventory management, and in this game, Chris has only 6 slots to work with, while Jill has 8. And even then, it was very difficult to maintain everything. On top of that, she gets a lockpick for easy access to some really good loot. It was a no-brainer just to simply start over with Jill. Don't worry, I'll be punching rocks soon as Chris in Resident Evil 5 at some point. The game really begins with a string of mysterious murders that have taken place inside Raccoon City. According to the reports, people weren't just killed, but they were eaten as well. We're part of a team known as STARS, Special Tactics and Rescue Service. We're here to investigate the disappearance of our own Bravo team, who was already sent to investigate said murders. Our helicopter lands, and shortly after, we're attacked by zombified dogs who kill off Joseph Frost, expendable side character. We seek refuge inside the Spencer's mansion, and this is where a majority of the game takes place. You're cut loose now from the intro cinematic, and you can explore your surroundings and get a feel for what this game's about. Now, immediately something that caught my attention and what I think contributes beautifully into the horror aspect here are the fixed camera angles. A fixed camera, depending on the game, can either be a benefit or a cardinal sin. In most cases, it does not work, especially in action games. But in Resident Evil, it certainly does. See, what a lot of horror games do is they weaponize uncertainty. The anxiety behind not knowing where or what is beyond your vision creates beautiful tension. In Resident Evil 1, you will almost always hear a zombie before you actually see it. Not knowing where or how close it is can be quite the fear inducer. The environment becomes much more of a threat. You no longer have dominance over space because you lack control over your own perspective. Corridors become that much more congested. Rooms with awkward angles harbor a feeling of malice behind it, almost as if we are stalking our own character. It is so impressive to me how such a simple design choice can structure an entire game's experience. Now, this is not to say that horror games without a fixed angle are not as terrifying or bad. As a matter of fact, I think first-person horror games are the scariest, because that immersion factor is unmatched compared to any other point of view. Also, there are plenty of issues when it comes to the camera in this game. For one, while not seeing a zombie is kinda scary, try shooting at it then. About half of my combat footage, quote unquote, is shooting something off screen. I've had multiple encounters where I'm at the precipice of 2 different camera angles, where I have to constantly readjust myself just to line up a freaking shot. And as someone who is, recording and trying to get good footage of a spider boss or something, this can be very frustrating. Don't get me wrong, the horror factor is still intact, but at the risk of the gameplay being disjointed and annoying to deal with, which is fine because, at least for the first game, combat is not the main focus here. Now, when I started this series, the thing I was excited the most about were the zombies and the mutated monsters. Resident Evil's story basically being a giant experiment gone wrong and seeing the results of that was disturbing and disgusting in all the right ways. Resident Evil 1 is the first game, so as the foundation, you want to ground your enemy designs, have a root that lets the rest of the series build from, but leave enough room where each game can have their own unique interpretations. When I saw that cutscene with the zombie eating our partner, it awakened a primal discomfort that I haven't felt since I was a child. That eerie slow turn, the attention to detail, the noises it makes while eating, it was a perfectly orchestrated scene to set the mood for the rest of the game. If I'm being honest with you guys, I could make an entire video about this one 10-second clip. It's probably my favorite scene in the entire game. All the monsters in Resident Evil 1 can be explained by the failure of producing an effective bioweapon. This is known as the T-Virus, developed by the company known as Umbrella. Now this is the core of what makes Resident Evil, the lore behind the outbreaks, Umbrella, the T-Virus, all of this. The T-Virus, or Tyrant Virus, was produced as a means to eliminate the need for a conventional army. A powerful bioweapon, one that could eliminate a targeted population with a 100% mortality rate. However, producing such a thing was nearly impossible. Umbrella realized this was a lost cause, so instead they opted to create a new generation of modified soldiers, and other bioweapons that could function at a much higher rate than their average natural counterparts. The zombies you encounter in the game were humans injected with an early string of the T-Virus, in the hopes that they would become physically stronger and continue to fight, even if their organs should fail. Now theoretically, this was a success, but what was lost was their humanity. These zombies would turn to cannibalism, and function solely on their own twisted instinct to feed. Unlike your traditional zombies, you know, a corpse that has been reanimated, the zombies in Resident Evil are not really dead, but are in fact humans that are still alive, but infected and controlled by the T-Virus. This makes killing them all the more disturbing as you are ending the life of someone who was, and technically is, still human, even if their death was off-screen. Umbrella would then shift back towards making a fatal virus, but also develop other bioweapons to hunt down any survivors, which is why the Hunters exist. They are the result of injecting reptilian DNA into a human embryo, using the T-Virus as a bonding agent. As you progress through the game, the Hunters become much more common because you have much better gear now. And they're brutal, I'll be honest, easily the most dangerous enemy in the entire game for me. However, to be frank, you can break their ankles and that solves like 90% of your problems. But this does create an interesting dynamic. In the mansion, in the courtyard, residence, and other places in Resident Evil, you have to make a decision whether to leave a monster alive in a specific room or not, because trust me, you're not going to have enough resources to take down every single one. It would be smart to kill off zombies in popular areas and leave others alone in rooms that you'll probably only visit once. But there's a problem. See, some zombies carry a mutated string of the T-Virus and have evolved into the more dangerous Crimson Heads when they're killed. These zombies are hyper-aggressive, charging at the player and even clawing at other zombies just to get at you. I made the mistake of killing a zombie in a popular corridor on numerous occasions, which I had to go through about like 70 times, and every time I entered through, it was a race to get to the door before he got to me. This creates another layer of decision making that makes the horror experience all the better. You have to balance your resources, and then at the same time, be wise on where you decide to use said resources. On top of human experiments, Umbrella played God with animal subjects too, even plants for that matter. Now there are 3 main animals I want to talk about who were easily my favorite parts of the entire game. Web spinners were the first wave of bioweapons produced by Umbrella, but they were quickly extinguished due to their surprising lack of power and intelligence to control. However, the black tiger was an exceptional specimen that grew 3 times larger than other spiders, but was quickly abandoned inside the tunnels underneath the mansion when the outbreak hit. This is one of the more memorable boss fights of the game for me, and is a great example of how bad the camera was during combat. I tried so hard to get good footage of this guy, but the game refused to do so without me taking a lot of damage. Out of the 3 bosses, this one was the most disappointing, but still memorable in the fact that it was disappointing, if that makes sense. Now, Yawn, on the other hand, was perhaps the most dangerous. Its name was given to this giant snake due to the appearance of its open mouth resembling a yawn. I give that like a 2 out of 10 origin name. Yawn not only grew in size, but aggression and poisonous capabilities. Unlike the Black Tiger, Yawn actually has a kill count of over 7 people before they left the mansion completely. As Jill, I encountered Yawn twice, up in the attic area and in the library. While both encounters were very easy and very short, I love snakes, and I think Yawn's design was brilliant, even though it really is just kinda, a giant snake and that's it, but it's still cool. However, I think the scariest mutated animal in the game for me was easily Neptune, a giant great white shark held captive within the Aqua Ring. Now for those who don't know me, I have a very healthy fear of sharks. I am terrified of them. Even in this game with its limited graphics, I am still very much agitated by even the baby sharks that stalk Jill. And keep in mind, this game is like 23, almost 24 years old. After a certain amount of time in the Aqua Ring, suspenseful music would begin to swell. I could barely see at the bottom of the screen a much bigger shark just waiting to kill me. And it would. It would pounce up onto the railing, and I was so scared that I actually died a few times in this room. Neptune, much like the other animals, was a part of Umbrella's early development into bioweaponry. But beyond that, not much else is known about this shark. This is a small branch of Umbrella's experiments that not only enhances the horror of Resident Evil 1, but it extends a great branch towards other potential animal experience for future games to play around with. This game is only about like 10 hours long, but having that variety between zombies and mutated animals is very well done, especially when you get into the end game. The Chimera is a hybrid bioweapon, a fusion between insect and man. Not only is its design disturbing, but the lore behind it is repulsive. See, Umbrella had a problem with animal mutations. They would grow stronger, although not enough to satisfy their needs, but what they really lacked was intelligence to even take orders, to control. So what they did was capture homeless women, bring them into the mansion, and forcibly impregnate them with modified embryos. I'll just let that sit for a second. It was not a success, thankfully, and the project was soon abandoned. The remaining chimeras endlessly roaming around the final lab section you come across. Their misshapen bodies and unholy resemblance to both parents makes them the most disturbing creature in the game from a design perspective. But there is one last enemy, or boss rather, that I do want to talk about to wrap up this whole section, and that is the Tyrant, the final boss in Resident Evil 1. The Tyrant project was dedicated to developing the ultimate life form, and found moderate success. Tyrant T-002 retained its human-like intelligence, and gained unnatural strength, capable of bursting through concrete with ease. It developed a giant claw hand and grew in size to roughly 8 feet and 7 inches. Too bad it wasn't strong enough to withstand a rocket launcher. Personally, I think the horror of Resident Evil 1 and the entire series comes from these enemy designs. They're a perfect representation of experimental horror, where science goes completely wrong, which I guess is sci-fi horror, stripping away all of what makes their subjects human, or what they were beforehand, turning them into mindless killing machines, mutating animals into monstrosities. Their designs are not just there to scare you, but they serve a narrative purpose. A Chimera's design on its own is scary, no doubt, but it's the story behind it that truly makes it terrifying. Resident Evil also does a freaking good job with introducing lore and giving players fantastic world building. How does it do this? It does it through notes and documents you'll find across the game. I found a slideshow showcasing all the bioweapons Umbrella had deemed a success thus far. It was so cool to see the methodical approach behind the monsters in this series. There was also a journal with multiple entries detailing a survivor's transformation into a zombie. It was quite sad, yet brutal at the same time. I mean, I could talk about how this game plays into claustrophobia or its survival horror genre, and of course it does, but other games do that too. Not many games have such dedicated lore and a story behind the why of their design choices. This is what makes Resident Evil so special. So we talked about the camera angles, the enemy designs, now I think it's time to talk about the atmosphere. I don't know about you guys, but I love early 2000s graphics. Perhaps it's because I was born in 2000, but there is something about the lack of detail that can make a game like this feel a bit uncanny, where your imagination needs to fill in the blanks. This works because of your personal bias, your personal fears, and so it amplifies the entire game based on your own perspective. Combine that with the fixed awkward camera angles and you have a perfect horror experience. What I love about this game is the lack of a soundtrack when it matters most. There's no loud theme playing in the background most of the game while you're exploring. Your only companion is the sound of your echoing footsteps, thunder, and other natural noises. Where you will always find music playing is inside a safe room. This creates a sense of peace and calmness. Whenever you hear that soundtrack, you know you're safe. And when that music plays, it is just beautiful. The mansion is a great setting for a horror game. It's this giant maze. It has a lot of open rooms that allow you to breathe, then right next door is a chokehold of a room or a corridor. You never know what's behind a new door, and when you have to backtrack, sometimes the game surprises you. This game loves to throw curveballs like that, especially when you find an item which triggers a zombie to appear or something similar. The mansion itself feels hostile, but more than that, the courtyard, the underground tunnels, the labs, it all feels abandoned, but not really at the same time. Even with the limited graphics, you can tell some rooms are disgusting, left in a state that would rot off your nose after 5 seconds. I honestly only expected to be inside the mansion for the whole game, and actually I was totally down for that. When the game expanded towards the courtyard, residence area, and other places, I was genuinely surprised by how big the game was and the variety it possessed. The atmosphere in Resident Evil 1 is great, and I think it did a very good job in complementing the horror behind this game. Now, of course, this game's not perfect in the horror genre. This next point may seem irrelevant, but let me explain why it takes away from my personal scare factor. I went in knowing that this game was going to be primarily a puzzle game. I had my expectations there. I knew I was going to run around carrying items across the mansion to unlock a door, only to find another item for another puzzle I'll discover later. Now, just because I knew this was what I was going to be doing doesn't really soften the blow. I am notoriously bad at puzzles like this. I have a habit of getting lost for hours because I just can't figure out what to do. I have no issue with using a guide or a walkthrough, but I'll try to solve it on my own first. This game is like a scavenger hunt. I was never good at scavenger hunts, and even now, I am still terrible at 25 years old. Let me be very clear here. This is a me problem, not the game. But what I will say is it definitely dampened the overall experience. I almost quit a couple of times because the tedious tasks I had to do in order to unlock like a freaking tiny box was so aggravating. But I was so far in at that point, I wanted to at least say I finished the game. And at some point, I reached a state of zen and was fine afterwards. Now, I know I'm not the only one who has mentioned this, and I attribute that to that older game difficulty. The lack of direction, the maze of a mansion, you had to explore every nook and cranny to find something, the lack of inventory space, it was all such a nightmare. Do you know how many green herbs I shoved down my throat without being hurt, just to free up space for like a book? The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I want you to understand from my perspective how the horror sorta took a step back a majority of the game. I said in the intro that Resident Evil 1 is like a puzzle game with a coat of horror painted over on top of it, and I still think that after finishing the game. I'm not diluting the horror experiences I had, but when looking back, what I remember was those moments being far and few in between. A horror game usually has moments of intensity followed by reprieve, to let the player gather their senses, reflect on what just happened. In Resident Evil 1, that reprieve was replaced with frustration because after discovering a new area or enemy, I was subconsciously preparing for the annoyance of trying to solve another puzzle. Again, this is a me problem, not the game. But let me say this, the puzzles definitely got in the way of the horror behind Resident Evil 1, because for me, I got frustrated a lot. I mean, when the main appeal of the game, the horror aspect, becomes a sideshow, that's when I have a problem. However, this does not blind me to the ingenious design behind this game's horror factor. The reason why I say Resident Evil 1 is terrifying, but not that scary anymore, is because the lore to gameplay is vastly different. Gameplay, it's puzzles, it's exploration, a little bit of action. The lore describes all the terrifying things that have happened and are currently happening. The enemy designs are still terrifying. I mean, imagine these designs in recent modern graphics. That would be something to behold. The positives I've already mentioned outweigh the negatives significantly. This is what makes Resident Evil 1 an amazing horror game, even though, right now, it's not that scary anymore because it is outdated. And let's be honest here, there are plenty of other horror games that I deem to be much scarier, for example, Total Chaos, that just recently came out. But Resident Evil 1 is a classic, and in the end, I very much enjoyed my experience. Now, if you were to ask me to rate this game based on its horror factor alone, Resident Evil 1, I think, scores a solid A. It was a strong foundation for the franchise, and even though it is over 23 years old, it still carries a sense of dread, isolation, intensity, and disturbing imagery. Thanks for watching, and in the next episode, we'll be tackling the horror behind Resident Evil 0. I'm not really good with outros, so for now, if you did enjoy, be sure to leave a like and to subscribe for more content like this. And I'll see you in the next episode. Take care, everyone, and of course, stay safe.